All right, Pittsburgh Ultimate back here again. This is the sourdough culture. So I covered it up. This is sourdough Jack again. And what we're gonna see is as I take off, you can quite tell, but that was bulging upwards from all the gases released. That is what sourdough culture looks like after the first feeding. So what we're gonna do now is we're gonna feed it a second round. We're gonna give it another cup of flour and another 6 ounces of water. Mix it up real good and then take some starter out to be the next batch. So let's see. So another cup of flour. All right, 1 cup of flour, water. There we go, 6 ounces of water. And then we're gonna mix that up real good. All right, so we've now fed this a total of 2 cups of flour and 12 ounces of water, plus the sourdough starter, what came out of the sourdough starter. And generally, what I aim to do is have about 6 ounces of sourdough starter that goes back into the jar. Doesn't really matter how much you take in and out, as long as you want it to be about consistent on, every time. Whether that's 6 ounces or 8 ounces or who knows. But let's see. So I mix this up real good. And the consistency of this isn't super duper important. You want it to be relatively thick, but you can see it's like kind of glomping. I don't even know, whatever that word is. All right, so you get that mixed up pretty good. So that's a fresh batch of food for this culture. And the next thing that I do, open up my jar that keeps the culture in, and I start putting some back in. So this is gonna go back in the refrigerator to be used next time I make bread. Start the process all over again. I don't know if you could just hear that little sounded like a air bubble getting released. That's exactly what that was. That's a batch of sauerkraut on the back side of the phone. And it's off-gassing, which is what all these ferments do to some extent. So the jar I'm using here is a 1 pint mason jar. Its origin was probably Green Mountain Gringo salsa. But it's nice because it's got some markings on the side. So that's a half of a pint. Half of a pint is 1 cup or 8 ounces. So I typically aim somewhere between 1/4 and 1/2. I tend on a little bit on the high side. That way, if I want to give some culture to somebody, I can do that. If you want to, once you get a culture, you can kind of give it away you can start up a whole new batch by just like a spoonful in the same 1 cup of flour to 6 ounces of water ratio. So that's like, I don't know, 6 or 7 ounces of sourdough culture to go back into the fridge. All right, so now that'll go back in the fridge. The next thing, this is where this starts to become bread. So I like to use a bamboo spoon for this part. And this is where the recipe is a little bit nebulous. I tend to do about 1 2/3 to 1 3/4 cups of flour. So I always measure the first one, and then I kind of just take a little bit of a guess at the second one. And you can always add a little bit more flour or water as you need to. So that's about what I'm putting in the second one. So that's flour. And then the other thing that goes here is salt. So, I don't know, I usually don't measure this particularly well. I usually do like the hand measure, but so I usually like, I think the recipe that I go based on is like a half a teaspoon of salt. This is a kind of coarse ground salt, so I tend to go a little bit more. So that's salt. And then you mix it up. So this is going to start being kind of dry and be a dough. And I keep this other metal spoon around to scrape off the bamboo one. But so let's see, this slowly starts to become something that looks more like dough and less like just kind of goopy liquid. And at this point, what I'm going for is a texture. So the amount of flour is kind of trying to get close, and then I will adjust as necessary. So I think the recipe that I use was originally, well, I started making bread with the New York Times no knead bread recipe, and then I adapted that to use sourdough rather than yeast. And I tend to find that the description in that, I think, says make this ball look like a shaggy hedgehog. When I do that, it tends to be a little bit more moisture content than I'm looking for in my dough. Doesn't seem to change, you know, a little bit of difference here and there doesn't change that much, but in terms of getting the dough out of the bowl in the morning for the next round, that's where it tends to matter. So, you know, you see I'm making this ball, and, you know, I will try and scrape as much of the dough back in as possible, because, you know, every little bit is a delicious little bit of bread, increasing the size of the loaf of bread. All right. So you can see it's kind of, it's like dough. It's not, I'm not really kneading this, but it's not exactly not kneading it. I don't know. Anyway, you can see it starts to stick down to the bowl a little bit. If you touch it, I mean, you're gonna end up baking this at 450 degrees. I'm not too worried about anything. You can touch it, and it's a little bit sticky. This is actually a little stickier than I want, so I'm gonna put a little bit more flour in. Which of course is gonna require me to mix it up a little bit more. All right. So now that's probably up to about 1 3/4 cups. Really, as a baker, you should probably weigh your flour out rather than measuring. It's a little bit more accurate, a little bit more reproducible. All right, that's a little bit drier than I want it to be, but it'll be just fine. So this ends up being a fairly high moisture content bread anyway. So yeah, all right, maybe a couple more drops of water. All right, cool. So that's the dough. And then you're gonna let this sit overnight. Or if you did this, well, anywhere from, I don't know, say 10 to like 14 or 15 hours. So I'm gonna cover this up with saran wrap again. You can do it with just a cloth, and that works, but it tends to dry out the surface of what will become the bread. So this is the dough. Let it sit for, I don't know. Well, I'll be back in the morning. Right now it's 6:05. So I started first round at 11:45 this morning. About 5:45, so 6 hours later, the culture was live and kicking. Make the dough. I'll be back in the morning.